The book of Romans is often considered the Apostle Paul's greatest theological work and one of the most important books in the entire Bible. Written around AD 57, while Paul was in Corinth, the letter was addressed to the believers in Rome, a diverse community of Jewish and Gentile Christians. Paul's purpose was to present a clear, detailed explanation of the gospel and its power to save all who believe. More than a letter, Romans is a systematic unveiling of God's plan for humanity, revealing the need for salvation, the means of redemption, and the call to live by faith. Romans begins with a powerful introduction. Paul declares, "I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes." This sets the tone for the entire letter. The gospel is not just good advice, it's the very power of God unleashed for salvation, available to both Jews and Gentiles. Paul then transitions into humanity's universal problem. In chapters 1 through 3, Paul outlines the fallen state of all people, whether Jew or Gentile. All have sinned and fall short of God's glory. Paul emphasizes that no one is righteous on their own. He writes in Romans 1:21 that even though people knew God, they did not honor him, and instead turned to idolatry and sin. This section confronts human pride and reveals our desperate need for God's mercy. But Romans doesn't stop at the bad news. From chapter 3 onward, Paul reveals the good news of justification by faith. In Romans 3:24-26, he explains that we are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Justification means being declared righteous in God's sight not because of our works, but because of Christ's sacrifice. Through faith in Jesus, we receive peace with God. Romans 4 brings Abraham into focus as an example of faith. Paul reminds us that Abraham was declared righteous not by works, but by believing God. This same faith is available to us today. Paul is clear salvation is a gift, and it comes through trusting in God's promises. One of the most beautiful passages in Romans is chapter 5, where Paul says, "While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." This shows God's love is not based on our performance, but on his grace. Through Jesus, we have peace with God and access to his presence. Paul contrasts Adam, whose sin brought death, with Jesus, whose obedience brings life. The idea here is simple but profound. What Adam broke, Jesus restored. Romans 6 addresses a common question. If grace is so abundant, should we keep on sinning? Paul's answer is firm. By no means. He explains that when we were baptized into Christ, we died to sin and were raised to new life. This means believers are no longer slaves to sin, but are now servants of righteousness. Grace doesn't give us permission to sin, it gives us power to overcome it. In Romans 7, Paul gets personal. He describes the inner struggle with sin. The good that I want to do, I do not do. But the evil I do not want to do this, I keep on doing. This vulnerability reminds us that even the great apostle wrestled with temptation. Yet this leads to the triumphant declaration in chapter 8. There is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. This chapter is often called the greatest in the Bible, because it speaks of the believer's new identity, the indwelling spirit, and the promise that nothing can separate us from God's love. Romans 9:11 shifts to God's relationship with Israel. Paul grieves that many of his fellow Jews have rejected Christ, yet he affirms God's faithfulness to his promises. Romans 11:29 declares, "The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable." Paul explains that Gentiles are now grafted into the promises of Israel, but they must remain humble. These chapters reveal God's sovereignty and salvation, and his unfolding plan for all nations. The final chapters of Romans are intensely practical. In Romans 12, Paul urges believers to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is true worship, not just singing or attending church, but offering our entire lives to God. He calls believers to humility, to use their spiritual gifts, and to overcome evil with good. Romans 13 emphasizes submission to authorities, not because they are perfect, but because God has allowed them to govern. Paul also underscores love as the fulfillment of the law. Love your neighbor as yourself. In Romans 14 and 15, Paul tackles the issue of conscience. He encourages believers to accept one another, especially when they disagree on disputable matters. Whether it's food, drink, or holy days, Paul's message is clear. Let us make every effort to do what leads to peace and mutual edification. These chapters promote unity and love in the church, placing relationship over ritual. Paul concludes in Romans 16 with greetings to fellow believers and a final word of praise to God. His benediction says, "To him who is able to establish you in accordance with my gospel, be glory forever." It's a fitting close to a masterpiece of theology, grace, and truth. Key teachings from the book of Romans: all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Justification is by grace through faith, not by works. Christ died for us while we were still sinners. Believers are united with Christ in his death and resurrection. There is no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. Nothing can separate us from God's love. God's promises to Israel are still valid. Offer your life as a living sacrifice. Love fulfills the law. Accept others without judgment over disputable matters. Why Romans still matters today. Romans is more than theology, it's a personal invitation. It teaches that salvation is not about religion but about relationship. It's not earned but received. Through Paul's words, we understand the depths of sin, the heights of grace, and the power of God to transform any life. For new believers and seasoned Christians alike, Romans is a foundational text that grounds us in the truth of the gospel and the mission of the church.